Roy always believed the hardest part of serving his country would be leaving home. He was wrong. The hardest part was coming back 6 months earlier than anyone expected, and watching a man walk out of his house before he even had the chance to knock on his own front door. For one suspended moment, nothing made sense. The gravel beneath his tires settled into silence. The late afternoon breeze carried the smell of freshly cut hay across the property he had dreamed about through countless lonely nights overseas. His hand rested on the steering wheel, yet he couldn't bring himself to open the truck door. He had spent months counting the days until he could finally come home. He had imagined many reunions. None of them began like this. Welcome to Hollow Creek Chronicles, a place where every quiet town has a hidden story, every stranger has a past, and every choice leaves a lasting mark. If this is your first visit, we're happy you found us. If you've been here before, welcome back. Subscribe and join us as we uncover stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. 6 months earlier, everything had changed with a single briefing. Roy had reported for what he expected would be another routine morning overseas. Instead, his commanding officer informed the unit that operational requirements had shifted. Several personnel, including Roy, would be returning home ahead of schedule. Their assignment had concluded sooner than anticipated, and transportation had already been arranged. For a few seconds, Roy simply stared. He had rehearsed the day he would return home so many times that hearing it was finally happening felt almost unreal. His first thought wasn't about himself. It was Jade. He reached for his phone more than once that afternoon. Every time he unlocked the screen, he smiled to himself before locking it again. No, she had spent enough birthdays alone, enough anniversaries through video calls, enough evenings pretending the empty chair across the dinner table didn't bother her. She deserved one surprise that belonged only to them. He could already see the expression on her face. She would probably be standing in the kitchen, flour on her hands because she never measured ingredients properly. She always insisted cooking was about instinct instead of recipes. If the biscuits came out uneven, she'd laugh before anyone else could. "You married me," she loved to tease. "You're stuck eating my experiments forever." He never complained. Some of those experiments should never have reached a dinner plate. But every meal reminded him he was home. That mattered more than perfection. Their marriage had never been built on grand gestures. It was built on ordinary days. Long conversations on the porch after work. Coffee before sunrise, while the fields slowly came alive. Driving into town on Saturday mornings, simply because Jade enjoyed browsing antique stores, even if they rarely bought anything. She always found beauty where other people overlooked it. That was one of the first things Roy had fallen in love with. When they bought the old farmhouse outside the small Wisconsin farming community, nearly everyone thought they had made a mistake. The roof needed repairs. The barn leaned slightly toward the east. After years of harsh winters, several windows had been boarded up. The porch sagged enough that stepping onto it required a little faith. Friends politely suggested finding something newer. Jade refused. She stood in the overgrown yard, looked toward the open fields, smiled, and quietly said, "This place just needs someone to believe in it again." Roy looked at her instead of the house. "If you believe in it," he'd answered. "I do too." That sentence had shaped the next several years of their lives. Every paycheck seemed to disappear into another repair. New fencing, roof materials, paint, lumber, insulation. They learned how to replace broken boards by watching online tutorials late into the night. They celebrated every small improvement as though they had completed an entire custom-built home. When Roy deployed again, Jade promised she would keep working on the property a little at a time. "Nothing dramatic," she'd told him over their last breakfast together. "Don't wear yourself out." "I won't." "You promise?" "I promise." He believed her, because Jade had never given him a reason not to. Military life had tested both of them in ways few people truly understood. Roy missed birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, ordinary evenings and quiet weekends. Jade carried responsibilities that had once belonged to both of them. She handled repairs, paid bills, managed unexpected expenses, shoveled snow, mowed the property, comforted worried relatives who often asked questions she couldn't answer herself. Whenever Roy apologized during their calls, Jade always answered the same way. "We're still a team." Simple words, powerful enough to carry him through difficult days. During the long trip back to Wisconsin, excitement refused to leave him alone. Every mile brought another memory. He stopped at a small roadside diner just outside the state line and almost laughed when he ordered the same cheeseburger Jade always insisted was better than anything she could cook. She would pretend to be offended every single time. "I should charge you for emotional damages," she'd joke. He could almost hear her voice. He picked up a small homemade apple pie from the diner's bakery, because Jade loved pie far more than cake. She claimed apples tasted like home. The cashier smiled while placing it inside a paper box. "Special occasion? My wife doesn't know I'm coming home today." The older woman smiled even wider. "Best kind of surprise there is," Roy agreed. As daylight slowly softened across rural Wisconsin, familiar roads replaced highways. Rolling fields stretched toward the horizon. Rows of corn stood tall beside weathered fences. Farm equipment rested beside barns that had watched generations come and go. Pickup trucks passed with friendly waves. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing felt complicated. The community had always moved at its own pace. People knew each other. Neighbors still stopped to help when equipment broke down. Church parking lots filled every Sunday morning. Children still rode bicycles without parents worrying every second. Roy had missed all of it. The closer he came, the lighter he felt. He turned onto the county road leading toward their property. His heartbeat picked up. Just a few more minutes. He pictured Jade opening the front door. Maybe she would cry. Maybe she would laugh. Maybe she'd hit him for keeping the surprise. He smiled at the thought. The gravel road narrowed before reaching their driveway. Everything looked familiar. The mailbox he had rebuilt before deployment still stood straight. The oak tree beside the entrance had grown fuller. Fresh grass bordered the fence line. Someone had clearly been taking good care of the place. His chest filled with quiet pride. Jade had done exactly what she promised. He turned into the long gravel driveway. The farmhouse came into full view. His smile remained for only a second. Parked beside the barn sat a white work van. No company logo, no lettering, no markings. Just a plain vehicle that didn't belong there. Roy instinctively eased off the accelerator. The truck rolled forward until it stopped. His eyes stayed fixed on the unfamiliar van. He searched his memory. Family? Neighbor? Contractor? Jade hadn't mentioned hiring anyone. Not once. She usually told him every detail about the house, including repairs that cost less than $100. This was different. The apple pie rested untouched on the passenger seat. Roy looked from the farmhouse to the barn once more. A feeling settled quietly in the back of his mind. He couldn't explain it. He only knew that something about this homecoming felt wrong long before he reached for the truck door. Roy stayed inside the truck for another few seconds, his fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel. His heartbeat had changed, not faster, heavier. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Farms needed repairs. Contractors came and went all the time. Maybe Jade had finally decided to fix something they had postponed for years. She had earned that right. She had carried the entire property on her shoulders while he was away. He reached for the apple pie on the passenger seat, picked it up, and stepped out of the truck. The afternoon air felt familiar. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted across the fields. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance. Wind moved gently through the trees bordering the property. Everything around him looked exactly the way he had remembered. Everything except the van. Roy closed the truck door as quietly as he could. Gravel crunched beneath his boots while he started toward the house. He had barely crossed half the driveway when the front door opened. His steps slowed. The screen door creaked. A man stepped outside. He wore faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a gray t-shirt with traces of drywall dust across the front. One shoulder carried a black backpack. In his other hand was a thick folder with several papers tucked inside. The man turned toward the driveway. His eyes met Roy's. Neither of them moved. The folder slipped slightly in the man's hand before he caught it again. Roy knew that face. Greg. The recognition landed immediately. For a moment, Roy questioned his own memory. Greg had been someone he trusted. Years earlier, before another deployment, Greg had helped Roy repair part of the barn roof after a summer storm tore away several shingles. They had shared meals around the same kitchen table, watched football together, spent weekends hauling lumber across the property. Greg wasn't family, but he had never felt like a stranger. Roy hadn't seen him in quite some time. The silence stretched between them. Greg looked as surprised as Roy felt. His expression wasn't one of someone expecting company. It was the expression of someone whose plans had suddenly changed. Roy searched Greg's face for answers. Instead, he found uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" Roy finally asked. His voice remained calm, though it took effort. Greg looked toward the house for only a brief moment before returning his attention to Roy. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Roy waited. The breeze lifted dust across the driveway. Neither man seemed aware of it. Greg adjusted the strap on his backpack. He stopped. Roy noticed something unusual. Greg wasn't dressed casually. His clothes looked like someone who had been working since early morning. There was white dust on his boots. His hands carried fresh scratches, the kind people collected while handling lumber or tools. Roy's eyes dropped to the folder. Building plans? Invoices? Contracts? He couldn't tell. His thoughts kept racing toward possibilities. Every answer seemed to create two more questions. Greg finally spoke. "Roy." Another pause. "This isn't what you think." The sentence hung between them. Roy frowned. "What exactly do I think?" Greg looked down. When he answered, it came quietly. "I can't explain it." "You can't?" Roy let out a short breath. "You can't explain why you're walking out of my house?" Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "It isn't my place." Roy took another step forward. "Whose place is it?" Greg didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the farmhouse once more. Roy noticed the movement immediately. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It looked more like someone trying to respect a promise. That only made Roy more frustrated. "If there's something I need to know," Roy said, "tell me now." Greg swallowed. "I really can't." "Can't or won't?" Greg met his eyes again. "I gave my word." Those 4 words landed harder than Roy expected. A promise? To Jade? About what? His mind refused to settle on one explanation. Every possibility competed for attention. He remembered all the late-night video calls Jade had answered from the kitchen instead of the living room. The moments when she looked tired, but insisted everything was fine. The times she changed the subject whenever he asked about the house. At the time, he assumed she didn't want him worrying while he was overseas. Now those conversations replayed differently. Greg shifted the folder beneath his arm. "I should go." Roy stood directly in his path. "I've been gone for months." "I know. I come home early." "I know." "I find you leaving my house." Greg nodded once. "I know." "You honestly expect me to accept this isn't what you think?" Without another word, Greg looked exhausted, not defensive, not angry, just exhausted. "I wish I could tell you everything." "Then tell me." "I can't." "Why?" "Because it isn't my story." Roy stared at him. Neither man spoke for several long seconds. Greg slowly stepped around him. Roy didn't stop him. Part of him wanted to grab Greg's arm and demand answers. Another part wanted to hear Jade first. If there was an explanation, it needed to come from her. Greg reached the white van and opened the driver's door. Before getting inside, he looked back one final time. "I know how this looks." Roy didn't respond. Greg gave a small nod, climbed into the van, and started the engine. The tires rolled slowly across the gravel. Roy watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the entrance to the property. Silence returned. A silence that felt much louder than before. Roy stood alone in the driveway. The farmhouse suddenly seemed unfamiliar. It was the same porch, the same windows, the same flower beds Jade had planted before he deployed. Yet something had changed. Not the house, the certainty he had carried all the way home. He looked toward the front door. The pie was still sitting in the truck. His duffel bag remained in the bed. None of it mattered now. He walked across the yard with measured steps. Each footstep seemed heavier than the last. He climbed the porch stairs. The wood creaked beneath his boots. His hand rested on the doorknob. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. He thought about every conversation he and Jade had shared over the past 6 months. Every promise, every laugh, every plan for the future. He wanted to believe all of it still meant something. Taking one slow breath, Roy turned the handle and pushed the front door open, fully expecting to face the worst moment of his life. The front door swung inward with a slow, familiar creak. Roy stepped across the threshold, his boots stopping almost immediately. Nothing inside matched the picture he had carried home with him. The first thing he noticed wasn't another person. It was dust. A fine layer covered the hardwood floor near the entryway. Protective plastic stretched across several pieces of furniture, turning the living room into a collection of white-covered shapes. Cardboard boxes lined one wall. A folded ladder leaned against the hallway entrance. His eyes moved higher. One section of drywall had been removed. Wooden studs stood exposed. Electrical wiring ran openly between them. Several ceiling panels were missing. A work light rested on the floor, beside a toolbox that had clearly been used only moments earlier. The house wasn't hiding company. It was in the middle of construction. Roy stood frozen. His mind struggled to replace one expectation with another. This wasn't what he had prepared himself to find. Not even close. The silence inside the house felt almost as surprising as the room itself. No television. No music. No voices. Only the faint hum of an air compressor somewhere deeper inside the house. He took another cautious step. "Deed?" His voice carried through the unfinished room. No answer. He swallowed. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with new paint and sawdust. It reminded him of the weekends they had spent repairing the farmhouse before his deployment. Back then, every improvement had been a shared project. Now he had no idea how long this work had been going on. He walked farther into the living room. The old couch had been pushed against the far wall, beneath a protective sheet. Their coffee table sat upside down. Family photographs had been removed from the shelves and stacked neatly inside labeled storage bins. Nothing appeared careless. Everything had been packed with purpose. He noticed a roll of blueprints lying open on the dining table. Several measurements had been written in pencil along the margins. Roy stared at them without touching anything. Blueprints? Who had drawn them? Greg? Someone else? More questions crowded his thoughts. A floorboard creaked somewhere upstairs. Roy looked toward the staircase. A second later, footsteps hurried across the hallway above him. Someone was moving quickly. His heartbeat climbed again. Jade? This time his voice came out louder. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence returned. A few seconds later, another sound reached him. A bedroom door opening. More footsteps. They came down the hallway. One step. Another. The staircase came into view. Jade appeared at the top. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She simply stared. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Roy barely recognized the expression on her face. Shock. Pure, unmistakable shock. Her hand remained wrapped around the banister, as though she needed it to stay balanced. She wore old jeans with streaks of white paint across one knee, and an oversized sweatshirt with rolled sleeves. A loose strand of hair had escaped her ponytail, and there was a faint smudge of dust near her cheek. She looked tired, more tired than she had ever allowed herself to look during their video calls. Roy? His name barely left her lips. She stopped. Roy managed a small smile that never fully formed. Surprise. The word sounded strange in the middle of such overwhelming silence. Jade blinked several times. You're home. I am. You weren't supposed to be home until winter. Our deployment ended early. She continued staring. You didn't tell me. I wanted to surprise you. She slowly descended the stairs without taking her eyes off him. Every step seemed careful, measured. When she reached the bottom, they stood only a few feet apart. Neither one reached for the other. That hurt Roy more than he expected. Every homecoming, he had imagined, ended with a hug. This one began with uncertainty. Jade looked past him toward the open front door. Her eyes searched the driveway. You came alone? Roy frowned slightly. Yes. She looked outside for another second before returning her attention to him. Something about that brief glance settled heavily in Roy's mind. Was she looking for Greg? Or simply trying to understand how he had arrived? Roy spoke gently. I saw someone leaving. Jade lowered her eyes. I know. It was Greg. Yes. Another silence. Roy searched her face. I didn't know he was here. I know. He said he couldn't explain. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. I asked him not to. Roy studied her expression. There was no anger, no panic, only exhaustion. Months of it. You asked him not to? Yes. Why? Jade looked around the room instead of answering. Finally, she said quietly, I wanted you to hear everything from me. Roy glanced across the damaged walls. The house. It's a mess. It wasn't supposed to look like this when I came home. I know. Neither of them seemed able to find the next sentence. Roy had spent countless nights thinking about this reunion. He had imagined laughter, tears, stories, questions about his trip home. Instead, they stood surrounded by exposed framing and covered furniture, speaking in short sentences that barely filled the silence between them. He looked toward the dining table. Greg's been working here? Yes. For how long? She hesitated. A while. A while meaning. Several months. Roy slowly nodded. You never mentioned it. I didn't. Why? Jade folded her arms tightly across herself. Because I didn't know how. Roy felt those words settle deep inside him. Not because of what they revealed. Because of what they suggested. This wasn't a simple repair. Something much larger had been happening while he was gone. Something important enough that Jade, who usually shared everything with him, had chosen to keep it entirely to herself. He looked around once more. The missing drywall, the exposed wiring, the carefully labeled boxes, the blueprints, the tools. None of this looked rushed. None of it looked accidental. It looked planned. Months of planning. Months that had passed without a single mention during their conversations. Roy looked back at his wife. He noticed details he had overlooked during the first few moments. The faint circles beneath her eyes. The cracked skin on her hands. The way she kept rubbing one thumb against the other whenever she became nervous. She had always done that when carrying a burden she didn't know how to put into words. He had seen it before. When her father became ill. When they signed the mortgage on the farmhouse. When he left for deployment. She was doing it again now. Only this time she seemed even more weighed down. Roy spoke carefully. Jade? She raised her eyes to meet his. What have you been carrying by yourself? Her lips parted. No words came. Instead, tears slowly gathered in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away before they could fall. Roy had known Jade long enough to recognize the difference between someone crying because they were guilty and someone crying because they had been trying to stay strong for far too long. At that moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. The problem waiting inside this house wasn't the one he had feared while standing outside. It wasn't another man. It wasn't betrayal. It was something far bigger, something Jade had been protecting him from for months. And judging by the look in her eyes, telling him the truth might change everything they believed about the life they were building together. Roy didn't speak. He simply stood there, looking at Jade as the last of her tears disappeared beneath the sleeve of her sweatshirt. Outside, the afternoon remained calm. A breeze rattled the leaves of the old oak tree near the driveway. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked once, before everything settled again. Inside the farmhouse, the silence lingered. It wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people realize they are standing at the edge of a conversation that could change their marriage. Roy slowly looked around the room again. The missing drywall, the exposed framing, the coils of electrical wire, the toolbox Greg had left behind. Nothing about this looked temporary. Nothing suggested a simple weekend repair. He turned back toward Jade. Start from the beginning. His voice stayed even. I don't want pieces of the story. Jade nodded faintly. You deserve the whole truth. She walked toward one of the dining chairs that had been pushed against the wall. Pulling it away from the covered furniture, she sat down, as though her legs had finally admitted how tired they were. Roy remained standing for another moment, before taking the chair across from her. Between them sat the old dining table, where they had once spread paint samples, renovation sketches, and handwritten budgets for the farmhouse they dreamed of restoring together. Today it held construction plans instead. Jade rested both hands on the table. I didn't lie when I told you I was keeping up with repairs after you left. Roy listened without interrupting. I really was. She glanced toward the open wall. At first it was little things. A leaking faucet, one broken window in the laundry room, replacing a few loose boards on the porch. She gave a tired smile. The normal list. Roy remembered those conversations. She had mentioned every one of those repairs during their calls. Nothing had sounded unusual. What changed? He asked quietly. Jade drew a slow breath. It started with the lights. The lights? She nodded. They flickered every now and then. Roy frowned. They've done that before. I thought the same thing. She looked toward the ceiling. At first, it only happened during storms. That's not unusual around here. I know, so I ignored it. She paused before continuing. A few weeks later, the kitchen breaker started tripping. Roy leaned forward slightly. How often? Once every couple of days. You didn't tell me. I didn't think it was serious. She looked down at her hands. I reset it every time. Roy remained silent. The refrigerator lost power twice while I was at work. I blamed the breaker. She gave a quiet sigh. Then, one evening, I smelled something burning. Roy's expression changed immediately. Burning? Plastic. The single word carried enough weight on its own. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. She swallowed. I checked the stove, the outlets, the laundry room. Everything looked normal. Her fingers tightened together. The smell disappeared after a few minutes. Roy's military training had taught him to recognize danger quickly. Electrical fires didn't always begin with visible flames. Sometimes there were warnings, small ones, easy to dismiss. What did you do? I called an electrician. You hired someone locally? Yes. What did they find? Jade looked toward the damaged wall. More than either of us expected. Roy followed her gaze. She continued carefully. The wiring inside this house wasn't just old. It had been patched over and over by different owners. Roy blinked. What do you mean? They found sections where aluminum wiring had been connected directly to copper without proper connectors. Roy's face tightened. They actually did that? She nodded. There were hidden junction boxes buried behind drywall. Some wires had cracked insulation. There were overloaded circuits feeding rooms that never should have shared the same breaker. She pointed toward the exposed wall. Once they opened everything up, her voice softened. They stopped counting problems. Roy slowly leaned back, He remembered how many repairs the farmhouse needed when they bought it. Most had been visible: roof, windows, flooring, paint. None of those inspections had revealed what was hiding inside the walls. They told me we were lucky. Lucky? Roy repeated. They said if one connection had heated up a little longer while I was sleeping. She stopped herself. Roy understood the sentence without hearing the ending. Neither of them wanted to say the words. Jade looked directly into his eyes. I could have lost the house. A longer silence followed. Roy finally asked the question weighing on him. So why is everything opened up like this? Because once they found one unsafe section, they had to inspect the rest. And almost every room failed inspection. Roy stared at the unfinished walls. So they couldn't just repair one section. No. They said replacing pieces wouldn't solve the problem. The entire electrical system needed to be rebuilt. Every outlet, every switch, every main line, every panel, everything. Roy slowly rubbed his jaw. How much? Jade hesitated. He noticed. Jade. She finally answered. The first estimate was just over $68,000. Roy looked at her in disbelief. For wiring? The house is over 100 years old. They had to bring everything up to current code. The panel, the grounding, the service entrance, the wiring inside every wall, smoke detectors, arc fault protection. She looked around the room. Once they explained everything, I understood why. Roy exhaled slowly. Even after years of careful budgeting, that number would have been difficult for anyone, especially while one spouse was deployed. You filed an insurance claim. It wasn't a question. She nodded. The adjuster came out. Roy waited. He inspected everything. Another pause. He said the damage wasn't caused by a storm or a recent accident. He classified it as long-term deterioration and outdated construction. Roy already knew where the conversation was headed. They denied it. Jade's eyes lowered, every bit of it. They wouldn't cover any of the replacement. They wouldn't cover temporary repairs. They wouldn't cover the inspection costs. They said maintaining aging electrical systems falls under homeowner responsibility. Roy remained still. He wasn't angry with Jade. He wasn't even angry with the insurance company. He was trying to understand how all of this had happened without him knowing. You talk to me every week. His voice stayed calm. Sometimes more than once? Yes. We talked about groceries, about the garden, about church, the neighbors, the weather. You told me when the mailbox needed repainting. You told me when one of the fence posts broke. You even told me when the washing machine made a funny noise. He looked around the room again. But this, he gently motioned toward the exposed walls. How did this never come up? Jade closed her eyes for a brief moment. Because every time we talked. She opened them again. You were somewhere I couldn't help you. Roy didn't answer. You'd tell me about long days, about missing home, about counting the months. I kept thinking. She shook her head. No, you already had enough on your shoulders. I couldn't be the person adding another burden. Roy wanted to respond. Instead, he listened. I kept telling myself I'd solve it before you came home. Her voice became quieter. I believed I had time. You weren't supposed to be standing here today. Roy looked at the construction plans scattered across the table. The missing walls finally made sense. The invoices, the tools, the dust, the months of silence. He still had one question. The estimate was almost $70,000. How did you even begin? Jade let out a weary breath. I called everyone I could think of. She managed a faint smile without any joy behind it. Most companies said the same thing. They were booked for months. The few who could start immediately charged even more. She glanced toward the front window, where Greg's van had been parked only minutes earlier. When I realized I couldn't manage it alone, she paused. I called Greg. Roy watched her carefully. He knew someone at the county office who helped explain the permit process. He introduced me to licensed electricians. He found contractors willing to schedule the work in stages instead of demanding everything up front. He coordinated deliveries whenever I was working. He made sure every inspection happened on time. She looked back at Roy. I never wanted him involved. I just didn't have another choice. The room fell quiet again. Roy looked toward the unfinished walls one more time. The fear that had greeted him in the driveway had changed shape. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply become something far more difficult to face. His wife hadn't been hiding another man. She had been trying, all by herself, to keep their home standing. Roy remained seated. His eyes stayed on Jade, but his thoughts wandered through every phone call they had shared over the past several months. He remembered asking if she had been sleeping well. She always answered with a smile in her voice. I'm fine. He remembered asking whether the house was behaving itself. Nothing I can't handle. He remembered apologizing for being so far away. Just come home safe. At the time, those answers had sounded reassuring. Now they carried an entirely different meaning. Jade rested her hands in her lap. I know what you're thinking. Roy looked at her. Do you? You're wondering why I kept choosing silence. I am. She nodded slowly. I've been asking myself that same question for months. Another quiet moment passed between them. Roy spoke carefully. I've always trusted you. I know. So help me understand. Jade drew a slow breath before answering. When the electrician first showed me what was inside the walls, I was scared. She glanced toward the exposed wiring, not just because of the cost, because I realized how close I had come to losing everything. She looked around the room. This house, our memories, our plans, the place we wanted to grow old together. Her voice remained steady, though exhaustion showed in every word. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd ignored that burning smell for one more week. Roy lowered his eyes. He knew enough about electrical failures to understand she wasn't exaggerating. You should have called me. I wanted to. So why didn't you? She leaned back in her chair. Because every time I picked up my phone, I pictured where you were. Roy said nothing. You weren't sitting in an office. You weren't working a normal job. You were thousands of miles away. She folded her arms across herself. Sometimes we'd go several days without talking. Roy nodded once. Communication during deployment had never been guaranteed. Schedules changed. Connections failed. Operations took priority. There were weeks when a 10-minute call felt like a gift. Jade continued. When we did get the chance to talk, I only wanted to hear your voice. A faint smile crossed her face. I'd spend all day making a list of things to tell you. The tomatoes finally came in. The church youth group painted the community center. The neighbor's dog got loose again. She looked down. The electrical problems were always at the bottom of the list. And every time we finally connected, I crossed them off. Roy frowned. Why? Because I could hear how tired you were. You tried to hide it, but I know you. She smiled sadly. You always said you were fine, and I always knew when you weren't. Roy remembered those conversations. She had an uncanny ability to hear what he never said aloud. I kept thinking. She stopped herself for a second. If I tell him about the house, he'll spend every day worrying. He'll wonder if I'm safe. He'll wonder if the place is still standing. He'll want to fix everything from the other side of the world. Her eyes met his again. And he won't be able to. Roy slowly looked away. She wasn't wrong. If she had told him the farmhouse was in danger, he would have carried that burden every day while being powerless to do anything about it. I convinced myself I was protecting you. Jade's voice had become quieter. At first, I believed I'd solve the problem before your deployment ended. So I waited. She rubbed her thumb against her fingers, the nervous habit Roy knew so well. Then the inspections found more damage. I waited again. The insurance claim came back. I waited again. The estimates got higher. I waited again. Roy understood the pattern. Every delay had seemed temporary. Every problem looked like one more obstacle she believed she could overcome before he returned. Only he had come home, 6 months early, breaking every timeline she had built around. Jade looked toward the staircase. Do you remember when we talked on our anniversary? Roy smiled faintly. You lit candles. You laughed because I burned dinner. It wasn't burned. It was, she almost smiled. It was a little burned. For the first time since he'd walked through the front door, a tiny piece of familiarity returned. It disappeared just as quickly. That night, Jade continued, I had already received the second repair estimate. Roy looked at her in surprise. You already knew? She nodded. I cried before our video call. I washed my face. I smiled. And I told you dinner looked wonderful. Roy searched his memory. She had looked happy, a little tired perhaps, but happy. He had believed every smile. I wasn't pretending because I didn't love you. She spoke firmly now. I was pretending because I did. Roy felt the words settle heavily between them. She wasn't asking to be excused. She was simply telling the truth. I wanted you focused on coming home. I didn't want you distracted by something neither of us could fix from thousands of miles away. Roy leaned back slowly. So you carried it alone. I tried. For how long? She thought for a moment. Long enough that I forgot what it felt like to share the weight with someone. The honesty in that sentence reached him more deeply than anything else she had said. Marriage wasn't supposed to work that way. Neither of them had intended it to. Yet little by little, that was exactly what had happened. Roy glanced around the unfinished room again. You've been working your regular job through all of this? Jade nodded. And more. What do you mean? I started taking extra shifts. How many? Whenever the hospital had openings. Roy knew Jade loved caring for people. She had always spoken about nursing with quiet pride. Helping others had never felt like a job to her. But hospitals demanded long hours even under ordinary circumstances. How many days were you working? Sometimes 6, sometimes 7. Roy stared at her. 7? There were weeks I left before sunrise. I'd work a 12-hour shift. Come home. Meet with electricians or inspectors. Answer phone calls. Review estimates. Fill out paperwork. Sleep. And start over. Roy finally understood the exhaustion he had seen on her face. The circles beneath her eyes. The cracked skin on her hands. The weight in her shoulders. It hadn't appeared overnight. It had accumulated one day at a time. You should never have had to carry all of this by yourself. I know, but I convinced myself I could. She gave a weary laugh. I've learned there's a difference between being strong and refusing to ask for help. Roy lowered his head. He couldn't deny that he understood the feeling. Military life often rewarded self-reliance. Solve the problem. Protect the people around you. Keep moving. He had lived that way for years. Without realizing it, Jade had been living the same way at home. Only her battlefield had been different. She looked at him with quiet sincerity. I never hid another man. I hid unpaid invoices. I hid inspection reports. I hid fear. I hid the possibility that everything we'd built together might disappear before you made it home." Roy swallowed. The picture in his mind had completely changed. The woman sitting across from him hadn't been choosing someone else. She had been choosing, over and over again, to shoulder burdens she believed belonged to her alone. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The afternoon sunlight drifted through the uncovered window, falling across the blueprints spread over the dining table. Roy finally broke the silence. "I spent the whole drive home thinking trust meant knowing everything." Jade listened. "I'm starting to wonder." He paused, searching for words that felt honest. "Whether two people can love each other so much that they accidentally stop letting each other help." Jade didn't answer immediately. Her eyes filled again, though this time she didn't wipe them away, because neither of them had an answer yet. Neither Roy nor Jade spoke for several moments. The quiet between them no longer felt filled with suspicion. It felt filled with questions. Roy looked toward the front window. Greg had been gone for only a short time. The folder he carried suddenly seemed far more important than it had a few minutes earlier. He stood from his chair. "Does Greg still have those papers?" Jade nodded. "He took them because we had another inspection scheduled for next week." Roy looked at the unfinished walls. "I need to see everything." "You should." Jade reached for her phone on the dining table. "Would you mind if I called him?" Roy hesitated for only a second. "No." She found Greg's number and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. Greg answered. "Hey." Jade glanced at Roy before speaking. "Can you come back?" A brief pause followed. "I think Roy needs to hear everything." Greg didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same restraint Roy had noticed outside. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Another pause. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." The call ended. Roy walked toward the open section of the living room wall while they waited. He gently touched one of the exposed wooden studs. The farmhouse suddenly seemed more fragile than ever. For years he had worried about storms damaging the roof or harsh winters wearing down the exterior. He had never considered that the greatest threat had been hidden inside the walls all along. 10 minutes later, the sound of tires rolling over gravel reached the house. Greg stepped onto the porch and knocked once before opening the screen door. He paused just inside the entrance. His backpack remained over one shoulder. The thick folder rested beneath his arm. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again today." Roy faced him. "I wasn't sure either." Greg nodded. "I understand." The tension between them had changed. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer carried the sharp edge it had outside. Roy motioned toward the dining table. "Let's sit." The three of them gathered around the same table where Roy and Jade had once planned flower beds, paint colors, and weekend projects. Greg carefully placed the folder in the center. "I figured one day we'd have this conversation." He opened the folder. Instead of loose papers, everything had been organized inside, labeled plastic sleeves. Roy immediately noticed the care that had gone into arranging them. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked hidden. Greg slid the first document across the table. "This is the original electrical inspection." Roy picked it up. Several photographs showed damaged wiring inside the walls. Each image had handwritten notes identifying safety violations. Another page listed code deficiencies. Roy silently read through the report. His military background had taught him to read technical documents quickly. Even without being an electrician, he understood enough to recognize the seriousness of what he was seeing. Greg pointed to one paragraph. That was the section that concerned the inspector the most. Roy looked closer. The report described deteriorated insulation, overloaded circuits, and unsafe connections that required immediate replacement before additional work could continue. He turned another page. A red notice had been attached. "Correction required before approval." Greg placed a second document beside it. "This came from the county building office." Roy read through the permit. "Electrical replacement. Panel upgrade. Code compliance inspection. Final occupancy approval. Every signature appeared official. Every date lined up with the timeline Jade had described. Greg reached into the folder again. This one explains why we couldn't just patch the damaged sections. Roy scanned the contractor's assessment. The recommendation remained consistent throughout. A complete replacement. Partial repairs would leave unsafe wiring connected to newer installations and would not meet inspection requirements. Roy slowly nodded. That explains the walls, Greg answered quietly. They had to reach almost every section. Next came invoices. Roy noticed there weren't just one or two. There were many. Inspection fees, permit applications, temporary power adjustments, material deposits, electrical components, framing repairs after wall access, drywall replacement estimates. Each expense had been documented. Some had already been paid. Others remained outstanding. Roy looked at Jade. "You've been keeping all of this?" She nodded. "Every receipt." Greg slid another page toward him. "This shows the payment schedule." Roy followed the figures carefully. Several balances had already been reduced. Not eliminated. Reduced. He looked back at Jade. "These payments. My overtime." Roy remained silent. Greg spoke again. "She wasn't exaggerating." "I know, because I watched it happen." Roy raised his eyes. Every week she'd finish a hospital shift, still wearing her scrubs half the time. She'd come straight here to meet inspectors or contractors. Greg gave a small shake of his head. "I told her more than once to slow down. She wouldn't." Jade looked slightly embarrassed. "There wasn't much choice." "There usually is," Greg replied gently. "You just didn't think there was." Roy studied Greg for a moment. One question still remained. "Why didn't you call me?" Greg didn't avoid the question. "Because I almost did." Roy waited. "The day we received the first estimate, I told Jade you needed to know. I even had your number pulled up." He gave a faint smile. "She asked me to put my phone away." Jade looked down. Greg continued. "She said if anyone told you it had to be her." Roy glanced toward Jade. She didn't deny it. Greg folded his hands on the table. "I respected that. You were my friend before all of this. You still are. But your marriage belongs to the two of you. I wasn't going to step into the middle of it unless someone was in immediate danger." Roy considered those words carefully. "If the house had become unsafe, I would have called you. If Jade had refused to leave, I would have called you. If I believed she couldn't protect herself, I would have called you." Greg's expression remained steady. "But none of those things happened. She made every decision with licensed professionals. Every permit was approved. Every inspection was scheduled. My job was helping coordinate the work. Nothing more." Roy looked through the remaining documents. The folder answered every question he had been carrying since he saw Greg leave the house. There were no hidden messages, no personal letters, no secret photographs, only paperwork, permits, invoices, inspection reports, receipts, building plans. Months of difficult decisions preserved on paper. Roy slowly closed the folder. For the first time since arriving home, he looked directly at Greg without suspicion. "I owe you an apology." Greg immediately shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I thought the worst. You had every reason to. I watched you walk out of my house." Greg gave a tired smile. "I've replayed that moment in my head at least a dozen times already." A brief silence followed. Roy finally extended his hand across the table. Greg accepted it. The handshake lasted only a moment. It was enough, not because every problem had been solved, because the truth no longer had to compete with fear. Greg stood. "I should let you two have some time." Roy nodded. "Thank you." Greg picked up the folder. "This stays here. He placed it gently on the table. "You'll probably want to read everything." "I will." Greg slipped on his backpack and headed toward the front door. Before leaving, he turned back. "For what it's worth." He looked first at Roy, then at Jade. "I've seen a lot of couples fall apart over problems much smaller than this. I hope you don't." After he left, Roy and Jade stood together on the porch, watching the white van disappear down the gravel driveway. The fields beyond the property looked as peaceful as they had earlier that afternoon. Yet life in a small farming community rarely kept uncertainty hidden for long. A pickup truck slowed as it passed the driveway. The driver glanced toward the farmhouse. A second vehicle rolled by several minutes later. Its occupants also looked toward the house before continuing down the road. Jade noticed it too. She quietly folded her arms. Roy followed the vehicles with his eyes. Neither of them needed anyone to say it aloud. In a town where neighbors noticed unfamiliar vehicles before breakfast and remembered them by supper, Greg's frequent visits had not gone unnoticed. The truth had finally reached Roy. Unfortunately, the rest of the community was already beginning to create a very different version of the story. Roy remained beside Jade on the porch long after Greg's van disappeared beyond the bend in the county road. Neither of them spoke. The folder Greg had left behind rested on the dining table inside the house. Yet Roy's attention stayed on the road. The two pickup trucks that had passed only moments earlier were already out of sight. Still, the way their drivers had slowed lingered in his mind. Jade quietly folded her arms against the cool afternoon breeze. "You noticed it too." It wasn't a question. Roy nodded once. "They were looking at the house. They've been looking for months." He turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Jade rested one hand on the porch railing. "In a city, a contractor's vehicle parked outside for weeks probably wouldn't mean anything." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Out here." She glanced toward the neighboring fields. "People notice everything." Roy looked across the farmland, stretching beyond their property. He had grown to appreciate the close-knit nature of the community after they bought the farmhouse. Neighbors brought over fresh vegetables during harvest season. When a winter storm blocked the county road, several families cleared driveways together before worrying about their own. If someone's tractor broke down, help usually arrived before they even finished making phone calls. It was one of the reasons he and Jade had chosen this place. Now he was beginning to see another side of that same closeness. Jade continued softly. "Greg's van has been here several days, every week." Roy listened. "Sometimes inspectors came. Sometimes electricians. Sometimes drywall crews. But Greg was the one people recognized." She looked toward the barn. His truck became familiar. Roy slowly understood. Most people driving by wouldn't know why Greg kept visiting. They would simply see the same vehicle outside a married woman's home while her husband was serving overseas. No explanation, only appearances. "When did you first realize people were talking?" Jade let out a slow breath. "A couple of months ago." "What happened?" "I stopped at the grocery store after work." She looked down at the porch floor before continuing. "Two women were standing near the produce section. They didn't realize I could hear them." Roy stayed silent. "They weren't saying my name, but they mentioned the old farmhouse. And they mentioned Greg." She swallowed. "One of them said she had seen his truck there almost every morning that week." Roy felt his jaw tighten. "What did the other one say?" Jade hesitated. "She said she hoped you never found out." The words settled heavily between them. Roy looked toward the road again. "And you didn't say anything?" "I wanted to." "Why didn't you?" "Because I knew what would happen." She met his eyes. "If I defended myself, it would only convince people there was something to defend." Roy couldn't argue with that. He had seen rumors grow before. Facts rarely traveled as quickly as assumptions. "What did you do?" "I bought my groceries." I smiled. "And I came home." Her voice carried no bitterness, only fatigue. I told myself people would lose interest once the repairs were finished. Roy slowly nodded. Instead, the opposite had happened. The longer Greg's van remained outside the farmhouse, the more opportunities people had to create their own explanations. Jade looked toward the unfinished living room, visible through the open front door. I stopped going into town unless I had to. Roy frowned. You never mentioned that. I know. I changed my shifts whenever possible so I could shop early in the morning. There were fewer people around. Roy thought back over their conversations. She had mentioned working different hours. He had assumed the hospital simply needed extra help. He hadn't questioned it. Now every small detail fit into a much larger picture. Church wasn't much different. Jade's voice became quieter. People were still polite. They smiled. They asked how I was doing. But conversations became shorter. They stopped asking if I needed anything. Roy understood what she meant. There was a difference between kindness and distance. Someone could be perfectly courteous while quietly pulling away. He looked across the yard. This must have been lonely. It was, she answered honestly. But I kept telling myself it wouldn't last forever. Roy rested both hands on the porch railing. I wish I'd known. So do I. The conversation paused as another vehicle passed on the county road without slowing. For a brief moment, everything felt ordinary again. Then Jade quietly said, Greg noticed it too. Roy turned toward her. He told me people had started acting differently. How? He'd walk into the hardware store, and conversations would stop. He'd wave at people he'd known for years. Some waved back. Some suddenly became very interested in whatever was on the shelf in front of them. Roy remembered Greg's expression outside the house. It hadn't been guilt. It had been weariness. Jade continued. He laughed about it the first few times. He said people always liked having something to talk about. Her eyes lowered. But after a while, he stopped laughing. Roy felt a knot settle in his chest. Greg had agreed to help because Jade asked. Now his own reputation was quietly paying the price. Later that evening, after putting away his duffel bag and changing into clean clothes, Roy offered to drive into town for groceries. You've had enough errands for one day, he told Jade. I'll go. She looked uncertain. You sure? He smiled gently. I'd like to. She handed him a short shopping list. The drive into town took less than 15 minutes. The roads were familiar. The grain elevator stood where it always had. The small diner near the intersection still displayed the same handwritten pie specials in its front window. A few children rode bicycles near the park. It looked exactly as he remembered. Roy parked outside the grocery store and grabbed a shopping basket. Several people greeted him warmly. A retired farmer shook his hand and welcomed him home. A cashier smiled and thanked him for his service. For a little while, everything felt normal. He collected milk, bread, eggs, coffee, fresh vegetables. Just before heading toward the checkout lanes, he realized Jade had asked for flour. He turned into the baking aisle. As he reached for a bag on the shelf, two voices drifted from the opposite side of the display. Neither person knew he was there. I heard Roy got back today, so he finally found out. A brief silence followed. Another voice answered quietly. I always wondered how long something like that could stay hidden. Roy remained perfectly still. The first speaker sighed. I just feel bad for him. So do I. I never expected that from Jade. Roy tightened his grip on the shopping basket. The conversation continued. I guess you never really know what's happening once somebody closes their front door. Neither person sounded cruel. They sounded certain. That certainty struck Roy harder than anger ever could. He stood motionless, listening as strangers discussed his marriage as though they had lived inside it themselves. Roy stood in the baking aisle without making a sound. The two voices continued for another few seconds before shopping carts rolled away toward the front of the store. He never stepped around the corner to see who they were. It didn't matter. They weren't the source of the problem. They were only repeating a story that had already found its way through the community. Roy slowly placed the bag of flour into his basket. His hands remained steady. Inside, however, disappointment settled over him in a way he hadn't expected. Only a few hours earlier he had questioned Greg himself. Now he realized an entire town had been asking the same questions without ever looking for the answers. He finished shopping in silence. The cashier greeted him with the same friendly smile as before. "Getting settled back in?" Roy returned the smile. "Working on it. Tell Jade we're glad you're home." "I will." Nothing in her voice suggested she had heard the rumors. Nothing suggested she hadn't. Roy thanked her, carried the groceries to his truck, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The parking lot was nearly full. Neighbors greeted one another. A father helped his young son return a shopping cart. An older couple loaded bird seed into the back of their pickup. Life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Roy rested both hands on the steering wheel. He had spent months believing the greatest challenge waiting for him was whatever secret Jade had been keeping. Now he understood another challenge had been growing outside the walls of their home. It wasn't broken wiring. It wasn't unpaid invoices. It was the ease with which people accepted appearances as truth. The drive back to the farmhouse felt shorter than usual. When he turned into the gravel driveway, Jade was already outside. She had changed into an old work shirt and was sweeping drywall dust from the porch. She looked up as he parked. "Everything okay?" Roy lifted the grocery bags from the truck. "It is now." She noticed something in his expression. "What happened?" "I'll tell you inside." They carried the groceries into the kitchen together, even with the unfinished walls nearby. Putting food into cabinets and placing milk in the refrigerator felt strangely comforting. For a few minutes, they focused on ordinary tasks. When the last grocery bag was empty, Roy leaned against the kitchen counter. "I heard people talking today." Jade's hands stopped moving. "About us?" He nodded. She looked down without asking what they had said. She already knew. "They thought they knew everything," Roy said quietly. "They'd never spoken to either of us, but they were completely convinced." Jade slowly sat at the kitchen table. "I was hoping you'd have a little more time before you heard it." Roy pulled out the chair across from her. "I wish you had never needed to hear it." Neither spoke for a moment. Finally Roy asked, "Has Greg heard things too?" Jade nodded. "More than he lets on." The next morning answered that question more clearly than either of them expected. Just after 8 o'clock, Greg's van pulled into the driveway. He climbed out carrying a clipboard instead of the large folder from the day before. He had barely reached the porch when another contractor's pickup arrived behind him. A middle-aged electrician stepped out. "Morning," Greg smiled. "Morning." The electrician returned the greeting politely, but there was an awkward hesitation that Roy noticed immediately. The conversation remained professional, brief, nothing more. As the electrician walked toward the open living room, Greg quietly let out a breath. Roy stepped beside him. "You've noticed it too." Greg gave a tired smile. "I was hoping I was imagining it." "You weren't." Greg rested the clipboard against his leg. "I've worked with that guy for years. He usually talks my ear off." Roy looked toward the electrician. Today the man had limited the conversation to work. Nothing personal, nothing unfriendly, simply distant. Greg shook his head. "I keep asking myself the same question." "What question?" "Whether I should have said no." Roy frowned. "When Jade first asked for help," Greg looked across the yard, "if I'd stayed out of it, people wouldn't be talking." Roy answered without hesitation. "If you'd stayed out of it, we might still be living in a house with dangerous wiring." Greg nodded slowly. "I know, but knowing, that doesn't stop me from wondering." Roy understood. Doing the right thing didn't always protect someone from unfair judgment. Sometimes it invited it. Greg continued quietly. My dad used to tell me that your reputation takes years to earn. He looked toward the road. And one afternoon for people to question? Roy thought about the grocery store, about the certainty in those strangers' voices. Not one of them had mentioned permits, or inspections, or hospital shifts. They had filled the empty spaces with assumptions, because assumptions were easier than asking questions. Later that afternoon, while the electricians worked inside the walls, Jade carried bottles of water out to everyone on the job. She handed one to Greg last. "I'm sorry." Greg looked surprised. "For what?" "For bringing you into all this." He shook his head immediately. "You didn't." "I did. If you hadn't helped me, you would have found someone else." "Maybe." She looked toward the road. "But they wouldn't be talking about someone else. They're talking about you because of me." Greg set the unopened bottle on the porch railing. "They're talking because they don't have the facts. That's not your fault." Jade lowered her eyes. "It still feels like it." Greg smiled gently. "You asked for help fixing your house. You didn't ask anyone to invent stories." She gave a faint nod. "I just hate that it's affecting you too." Greg shrugged lightly. "I won't pretend it feels good." He smiled again, though this one carried more determination. "But I'd rather be misunderstood for helping someone than praised for walking away." Jade looked at him with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." Roy had stepped outside just in time to hear those last few words. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he watched the exchange from the porch. There was no secrecy, no awkwardness, only two people discussing the cost of doing the right thing when others misunderstood it. That evening, after the contractors left, Roy wandered slowly through the unfinished living room. The exposed wiring no longer represented the biggest challenge before them. Electricians could replace damaged cables. Drywall could be repaired. Paint could cover patched walls. Those problems had solutions. The damage created by careless assumptions worked differently. Once people decided a story was true, convincing them otherwise often became far more difficult than fixing any part of the house. Roy stopped beside the open wall and looked at the new wiring already running neatly through the wooden studs. He thought about every rumor that had grown while he was overseas. None of them had started with evidence. They had started with silence. He finally understood something that hadn't occurred to him before. By trying to protect one another through silence, he and Jade had unknowingly left empty spaces where other people had written their own version of the truth. Roy stood quietly beside the exposed wall for another moment before turning back toward the kitchen. The house had grown noticeably quieter after the contractors left. The tools were stacked neatly against one wall. The temporary work lights had been switched off. Outside, the last light of day settled over the fields surrounding the farmhouse. Jade was sitting at the dining table. The folder Greg had left behind remained open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. She seemed lost in thought. Roy pulled out the chair across from her. This time, neither of them rushed to fill the silence. After everything they had learned during the day, there was no longer any need to speak, simply because the room was quiet. Finally, Roy rested his forearms on the table. "I've been thinking." Jade looked up. "So have I." He managed a faint smile. "I figured." She returned it, though only for a second. Roy looked at the folder. "When I pulled into the driveway this afternoon," he paused, "I had already convinced myself I knew what was happening." Jade lowered her eyes. "I know. I hadn't spoken to you. I hadn't walked inside. I hadn't asked a single question." He shook his head slowly. "I saw Greg leaving the house, and I filled in the rest myself." Jade listened without interrupting. "I wasn't fair to either of you." She leaned forward. "You had every reason to think something was wrong. I had reasons to ask questions." Roy answered gently. "I didn't have reasons to reach conclusions." The distinction mattered. He understood that now. Jade folded her hands together. I need to tell you something too. Roy nodded. I'm listening. I kept saying I was protecting you. She looked toward the unfinished living room. Part of that was true, but not all of it. Roy waited. There were nights I wanted to call you. She smiled sadly. I'd even rehearse the conversation. What stopped you? I was afraid. Afraid of what? She met his eyes. That you'd hear how overwhelmed I was. And I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle things while you were gone. Roy frowned slightly. I've never expected you to carry everything alone. I know, she answered honestly, but somewhere along the way, I started expecting it from myself. Roy thought back to the first days of their marriage. Whenever one of them faced a problem, they solved it together. Budget decisions, farm repairs, unexpected expenses, everything had been shared. Deployment had changed more than their daily routines. It had quietly changed the way they carried burdens. He spoke softly. I've spent years believing my job was protecting you. Jade gave a small nod. I know, but while I was gone, you decided your job was protecting me. A quiet understanding settled between them. Neither of them had acted out of selfishness. Neither had wanted to hurt the other. Each had simply tried to spare the other from worry. Instead, they had both ended up carrying more than they should have. Roy looked around the room. If we'd had this conversation 3 months ago, Jade finished the thought, things would have been different. They would. She let out a slow breath. I kept waiting for the perfect time. There wasn't one. Roy smiled gently. I've noticed life rarely gives us perfect timing. That earned the first genuine smile Jade had shown since he walked through the front door. Small, tired, but genuine. She reached across the table. Roy met her halfway. Their hands found each other naturally. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just familiarity. I need to apologize. Jade's voice was quiet. For keeping something this important from you. Roy squeezed her hand lightly. And I need to apologize for believing the worst before giving you the chance to explain. Neither apology erased the pain of the past several months. Neither was intended to. They simply marked the beginning of something both of them had almost lost. Trust rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. Jade looked toward the exposed walls again. I don't ever want us to do this again. We won't. You can't promise life won't become complicated. No, Roy smiled. But I can promise we won't face it separately. She studied his face for several seconds. You really mean that? I do. What if I fail? He looked genuinely puzzled. At what? At being strong. Roy gave a quiet laugh. I married you because you were honest, not because you never struggled. Her eyes filled slightly. I've spent so much time trying to prove I could handle everything. You never had to prove that. He gently brushed his thumb across the back of her hand. The strongest thing you've done today wasn't managing contractors. It wasn't working extra shifts. It wasn't fighting with the insurance company. She looked at him curiously. It was finally telling me the truth. The words settled over both of them. Jade nodded slowly. I should have trusted that you'd help carry it. You can. I know that now. Outside, the evening breeze moved through the fields. The familiar sound reminded Roy of countless evenings they had once spent on the porch, talking about ordinary things. Those conversations had slowly disappeared during deployment, not because they loved each other less, because distance had quietly taught them to protect one another with silence instead of honesty. Roy stood and walked toward the unfinished living room. Jade joined him. Together, they looked at the exposed framework running through the house. New wiring had already replaced several damaged sections. The old electrical panel sat disconnected near the wall, waiting to be removed. Progress was visible. Not complete, but visible. Roy smiled faintly. We'll finish this. Jade followed his gaze. The house The house. He looked at her. And us. She rested her head gently against his shoulder. For the first time since his unexpected homecoming, neither of them felt the need to defend themselves. They simply stood together, accepting that both of them had made mistakes born from love rather than malice. The farmhouse would eventually receive fresh drywall, new paint, new light fixtures. Visitors would never know what had once been hidden inside its walls. Roy understood that people worked much the same way. Some damage remained invisible until life forced it into the open. Ignoring it only allowed it to grow. Facing it together gave it a chance to heal. As they stood in the quiet house, Roy realized the contractors would almost certainly finish rebuilding the farmhouse long before he and Jade finished rebuilding the complete confidence they once shared. The repairs inside the walls had a clear schedule. Repairing wounded trust would require patience, honesty, and choices they would have to make every single day. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting through the open windows of the farmhouse. Roy woke before sunrise. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. Months of military routine still lingered in his body. His mind expected unfamiliar surroundings, shared barracks, and the sound of early morning preparations. Instead, he heard something he had missed far more than he realized. The gentle rustle of trees outside the bedroom window. He lay still, listening. Beside him, Jade was asleep. The deep exhaustion that had settled over her during the previous months had finally given way to peaceful rest. For the first time since Roy had unexpectedly returned home, she wasn't sleeping lightly. He smiled quietly. Without making a sound, he slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The kitchen looked much the same as it had the evening before, except for one small difference. The folder containing permits, inspection reports, and invoices remained neatly stacked on one corner of the dining table. Roy looked at it for a moment before walking toward the coffee maker. He measured the grounds the way Jade always did, not because it was the only way to make coffee, because it reminded him of home. A few minutes later, the familiar aroma filled the kitchen. He poured 2 mugs. Just as he reached for the second one, he heard footsteps above him. Jade appeared at the bottom of the stairs wearing the same oversized sweatshirt from the day before. She stopped halfway into the kitchen. "You made coffee," Roy smiled. "I remembered your method." She picked up the mug he offered. "You remembered the extra scoop. I remembered you saying the first cup should help people wake up." She laughed softly. "The second cup is supposed to help them become pleasant." Roy chuckled. "I remember that too." The laughter surprised both of them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It simply appeared on its own. The kind of ordinary moment they hadn't shared in far too long. They carried their mugs onto the porch. Morning sunlight stretched across the fields, while a light mist rested above the lower ground beyond the fence line. Neither of them felt pressured to fill every quiet moment with conversation. The silence felt comfortable again. After finishing his coffee, Roy stood. "So," Jade looked up. "So, I've got work to do." She looked confused. "What work?" Roy pointed toward the unfinished living room. "Our house isn't going to rebuild itself." A smile slowly spread across her face. "You just got home." "I know. You should rest." "I rested on the flight." She folded her arms playfully. "That doesn't count." "It counts enough." She laughed again. "I forgot how stubborn you are." Roy grinned. "I learned from you." By 8 o'clock, the contractors arrived. Greg wasn't scheduled that morning, but the electrical crew returned to continue installing wiring through the remaining walls. Roy introduced himself properly to each worker. Instead of standing back and watching, he asked a simple question. "What can I do that won't get in your way?" The lead electrician appreciated the offer. "There are stacks of drywall in the barn. If you don't mind moving them closer to the house, that'll save us some time later." Roy nodded. "I can handle that." For the next several hours he worked steadily. He carried drywall sheets, moved lumber, organized tools, swept debris from completed sections so the crew could continue without interruption. No one had asked him to prove anything. He simply wanted to become part of the solution. Every so often Jade stepped outside between phone calls with suppliers and inspectors. Each time she found Roy already working. At one point she caught him studying a wiring diagram spread across a portable workbench. "You know what you're looking at?" He smiled. "Not really." "Then why are you staring at it?" "I'm trying to look useful." She laughed hard enough that one of the electricians glanced over and smiled too. "You've been home less than 24 hours, she said, "and you're already pretending to know electrical plans." Roy shrugged. "I figured confidence was half the battle." The electrician overheard him. "It's about 10%. Roy smiled. "I was close." Even the electrician laughed. The mood around the property began to feel different. Not because the work had become easier, because everyone could see Roy and Jade working together instead of separately. Around lunchtime, Jade disappeared into the kitchen. When she called everyone inside nearly 40 minutes later, folding tables had been set up in the dining room. Simple sandwiches, fresh fruit, potato salad, homemade cookies. Nothing fancy, just enough for everyone. One of the electricians looked pleasantly surprised. "You didn't have to do all this." Jade smiled. "I know, but you've all been taking care of our house. It seemed like the right thing to do." Roy watched the conversation quietly. Months earlier, Jade had been meeting contractors alone. Today she stood beside him, while introducing everyone to the home they were helping restore. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was meaningful. During lunch, conversation drifted away from wiring and inspections. People talked about fishing, local high school football, the unusually mild weather. Roy noticed Jade joining the conversation without forcing herself to appear cheerful. She wasn't pretending anymore. She was simply present. After the crew returned to work, Roy carried empty plates back into the kitchen. He found Jade washing dishes. He reached for a towel without saying anything. She handed him the first plate. For several minutes, they worked side by side. Wash, dry, put away. The routine felt familiar, comforting. "You know," Jade said without looking up, "I got pretty efficient doing this alone." Roy smiled. "I don't doubt it." She glanced at him. "But I like this better." "So do I." He dried another plate before speaking again. "You've carried a lot while I was gone." She nodded. "I did. I don't want you carrying it alone anymore." She placed another dish into the sink. "I won't." "You promise?" She looked at him with a smile that carried more confidence than the promises she had made before his deployment. "I promise." The afternoon passed quickly. By early evening, the electricians had completed another section of the installation. Several portions of the house already looked noticeably different. Fresh wiring now replaced the damaged system hidden inside the walls for decades. As the trucks pulled away for the day, Roy stood inside the living room, studying the progress. Jade joined him. "You look proud." "I am." "Because we're getting closer to finishing?" Roy shook his head. "That's part of it." "What then?" He looked around the room before answering. "Yesterday, this house reminded me of everything we were carrying separately." He turned toward her. "Today." He smiled warmly. "It reminds me that we're carrying it together." Jade slipped her hand into his. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply looked around the unfinished farmhouse. The walls still needed drywall. The floors still needed cleaning. The electrical work still wasn't complete. There was more work ahead than work behind them. Yet something important had already changed. Roy finally understood that being a husband wasn't about shielding Jade from every burden she might face. It was about making sure she never believed she had to carry those burdens by herself. The next morning began with steady progress. The electricians finished testing another section of the new wiring, while drywall deliveries arrived shortly after sunrise. The farmhouse no longer felt frozen in the middle of a crisis. Every completed task made the next one seem a little more manageable. Roy tightened the last strap holding a stack of lumber in place before carrying it toward the front porch. Jade stepped outside with 2 bottles of water. Greg called. Roy looked up. "Everything okay?" "He said he'll be here in about 20 minutes. Roy nodded. "Good." Jade studied his face for a moment. "You've been thinking about talking to him." "I have." She smiled gently. "I thought so." Neither of them needed to say anything else. Some conversations couldn't happen through quick greetings or polite handshakes. They needed time. Greg's white work van rolled into the driveway a little before 9. This time, Roy walked toward it before Greg even opened the driver's door. Greg climbed out, holding a tape measure and a clipboard. "Morning, morning." For a second, both men stood there, unsure how to begin. Roy solved the problem first. "You've got a few minutes before everyone gets busy?" Greg looked toward the house. "I can make a few." Roy motioned toward the old barn. "Let's walk." They crossed the yard together. The barn had changed very little since Roy left for deployment. The roof they had repaired together years earlier still held strong. Roy rested one hand against the weathered wooden siding. "I've been wanting to say something." Greg listened quietly. "When I saw you walking out of my house," he paused, "I stopped seeing my friend." Greg lowered his eyes. "I figured I only saw the fear I'd built in my own head." Greg nodded once. "I would have probably reacted the same way." Roy looked at him. "I don't know." "I hope not." A small smile crossed Greg's face. "I appreciate that." Roy folded his arms. "I also owe you more than an apology." Greg frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You stood beside Jade when I couldn't." "I should have thanked you before now." Greg immediately shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks." "I do." Roy spoke with quiet conviction. "You helped protect our home. You respected our marriage. You kept your word even when it made your own life harder." Greg looked toward the fields before answering. "I wasn't trying to be a hero." "I know. I just couldn't watch Jade face all of that alone." Roy smiled. "That's exactly why I'm grateful." The words seemed to lift something Greg had been carrying. He let out a slow breath. "I'll be honest." "Go ahead." "I've been worried this whole situation would cost me our friendship." Roy answered without hesitation. "It won't." Greg looked at him carefully, making sure he meant it. Roy continued. "I trusted appearances instead of trusting the man I'd known for years. That was my mistake." Greg gave a quiet laugh. "I wasn't exactly comfortable either." "No? You think I enjoyed walking out your front door and finding you standing there?" Roy laughed for the first time since arriving home. "I guess not. I nearly dropped that folder. I noticed. I had about 20 different explanations running through my head. Were any of them good?" "Not one." Both men laughed. The sound echoed softly inside the old barn. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It simply felt like two friends finding familiar ground again. Roy leaned against one of the support posts. "You know what bothered me the most?" "What?" "I almost let one moment erase years of knowing who you are." Greg nodded slowly. "Fear can do that." "It can." For a while they stood watching the wind move through the fields beyond the fence. Finally Greg spoke again. "I've been thinking about leaving this project." Roy turned immediately. "What?" "I figured maybe another contractor should take over coordinating everything." Roy stared at him. "Because of the rumors?" Greg gave a small shrug. "I didn't want to make things harder." Roy shook his head. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, absolutely not." Greg waited. "You started helping because my wife needed someone she could trust." Roy looked him directly in the eye. "I'm not going to let gossip convince me to push away one of the people who actually showed up when we needed help." Greg remained quiet. Roy continued, "If you walk away now, people will think the rumors were true." Greg considered that. "I hadn't thought about it that way." "I have," Roy smiled. "So, unless you're leaving because the work is finished, you're staying." A grin slowly spread across Greg's face. That sounded less like a suggestion. It wasn't. They walked back toward the house together. As they approached the driveway, one of the neighboring farmers slowed his pickup near the mailbox. He rolled down the window. "Morning, Roy." "Morning. Good to have you home." "I appreciate it." The man looked toward Greg. "Looks like the renovation's moving along." "It is," Roy answered. "We've had a lot of help." He placed a hand briefly on Greg's shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without him." The farmer smiled politely. "Glad to hear it." He drove on. Greg looked at Roy. "You didn't have to say that." "I wanted to." Word traveled through the community much the same way rumors did. Only this time, people weren't seeing Greg arrive while Roy was away. They were seeing Roy working beside Greg every day. They saw the electricians, the inspectors, the drywall deliveries. They saw building materials stacked in the yard and permit notices displayed in the front window as required. They saw a renovation that had been there all along. The story hadn't changed. Only people's understanding of it had. A few days later, Roy stopped by the local hardware store for additional supplies. The owner greeted him with a smile. "Need more joint compound?" "Looks like it." The owner chuckled. "Old farmhouses always ask for one more trip than you planned." "They certainly do." While Roy waited for his receipt, another customer walked in. He nodded toward Roy. "Glad things are working out over at your place." Roy smiled. "They are. I heard you've got a good crew helping." "I do." The conversation moved naturally to renovation tips and local suppliers. No sideways glances, no whispered comments, no unfinished sentences. As Roy carried the supplies back to his truck, he realized something important. The rumors hadn't disappeared because someone had argued with them. They had faded because steady, consistent truth had quietly become visible. People eventually noticed what had always been there. A husband and wife rebuilding their home. A friend honoring his word. Workers restoring an old farmhouse. Nothing more. That evening, as the three of them stood reviewing the next stage of construction, Roy looked from the house to Greg and finally to Jade. He understood that trust wasn't something people earned once and kept forever without effort. It grew stronger every time words matched actions, promises became habits, and character remained steady even when circumstances invited doubt. The following week brought a rhythm the farmhouse had not known in months. Work began shortly after sunrise. Contractors arrived with their toolboxes. Roy unlocked the barn before anyone else reached the driveway. Jade reviewed schedules over her first cup of coffee before leaving for the hospital whenever she was assigned a shift. What had once felt overwhelming had become organized, not because the work had grown easier, because no one was carrying it alone anymore. By the end of the week, fresh drywall covered most of the exposed framing. Rooms that had looked unfinished only days earlier were beginning to resemble the home Roy and Jade remembered. The new electrical panel had already passed its inspection. The house felt brighter in more ways than one. One afternoon, Roy found Jade standing in the hallway, looking at the newly finished walls. She reached out and rested her fingertips against the smooth surface. "It almost feels strange." Roy joined her. "What does?" "Seeing everything closed up again." He smiled. "I know." She looked at the wall for another moment. "For months, every time I walked through this hallway, I saw work that still needed to be done." She turned toward him. "Now I finally see progress." Roy nodded. "So do I." Jade gave a thoughtful smile. "I've realized something." "What's that?" "I spent so much energy trying to prove I could handle everything myself." She looked around the hallway. "That I forgot people who love you actually want the chance to help." Roy remained quiet, letting her finish. I always thought asking for help meant I wasn't doing enough. She shook her head gently. I don't believe that anymore. Roy smiled. I don't either. She laughed softly. That's easy for you to say. He raised an eyebrow. Is it? You've always been the one taking care of everyone else. Roy leaned against the doorway. I thought that was strength. You don't anymore? I think strength looks different now. She waited. I used to believe protecting the people I love meant carrying every burden I could keep away from them. He folded his arms comfortably. But while I was away, I learned something without even realizing it. What? When I kept telling you to stay strong, I accidentally made it sound like you weren't allowed to struggle. Jade looked surprised. You never said that. I didn't have to, Roy answered honestly. Sometimes people hear expectations we never meant to create. The words stayed with both of them. Neither had intended to place impossible standards on the other. Yet somewhere between deployments, long-distance phone calls, missed anniversaries, and the desire to protect one another, they had quietly built those expectations anyway. Jade stepped closer. You know what helped me the most this week? What? You asking what needed to be done. Roy smiled. That wasn't exactly complicated. It was to me. She looked directly into his eyes. You didn't arrive home trying to take control. You didn't criticize the decisions I'd already made. You didn't spend every day asking why I hadn't done something differently. She reached for his hand. You simply asked how we could move forward. Roy squeezed her hand gently. I couldn't change the months you lived through. No, but I could help with today. She nodded. And that was exactly what I needed. Later that afternoon, Greg arrived carrying several inspection forms. He walked through the house with the county inspector, answering questions and checking measurements before the final review scheduled for the following week. When the inspection ended successfully, the county truck pulled away. Greg remained standing near the porch steps for a moment, looking toward the fields. Roy noticed the expression on his face. You look relieved. Greg smiled. I am. Roy joined him outside. Because we're almost finished? Partly. Greg rested both hands on the porch railing, but mostly because things finally feel normal again. Roy understood. The work had never been the difficult part. Everything surrounding it had been. Greg looked toward the driveway. I'll admit something. Go ahead. There were nights I drove home wondering if helping had been the right decision. Roy listened. I knew the repairs mattered. I knew Jade needed someone she could call. I knew the house wasn't safe. He paused briefly. But hearing people question my motives, he smiled faintly. That got heavier than I expected. Roy nodded slowly. I believe you. Greg looked at him. I almost let other people's opinions convince me I'd made the wrong choice. Roy answered quietly. You didn't. No. Greg looked back at the farmhouse. I'm glad I stayed. So am I. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Roy said, I've learned something too. Greg smiled. Seems like everyone has. Roy laughed. I guess so. He looked toward the house where Jade was organizing paint samples near the front window. Doing the right thing doesn't always come with immediate appreciation. Greg nodded. Sometimes it comes with questions instead. Exactly. Roy looked back at him. But if you only do the right thing when everyone understands it, you're letting public opinion decide your character. Greg smiled broadly. I wish someone had told me that a month ago. Roy chuckled. You probably wouldn't have believed them. Fair point. As the weekend approached, the farmhouse looked remarkably different. Fresh drywall covered every repaired wall. New outlets had been installed throughout the house. The temporary work lights were no longer needed, because the permanent fixtures had begun replacing them. The porch no longer held stacks of construction materials. Instead, Cans of paint waited for the final stage of the renovation. That Saturday evening, Roy and Jade carried 2 folding chairs onto the porch. Neither of them felt like working anymore. The sun slowly lowered across the fields, casting a warm glow over the property they had fought so hard to preserve. Jade leaned back comfortably. "I forgot how peaceful this place can be." Roy smiled. "I don't think we forgot." "What do you mean?" "I think we were just too busy carrying worries to notice it." She considered that for a moment. "I think you're right." A comfortable silence settled between them. After several minutes, Jade spoke again. "If something like this ever happens again..." Roy looked at her. "I won't wait." He nodded. "I won't either. I'll ask for help. And I'll remember that asking how you're really doing is just as important as asking whether everything's okay." She smiled warmly. "I like that plan." "So do I." Roy looked toward the farmhouse. Only a few finishing touches remained before the renovation would be complete. Paint, trim, final cleaning, small details. The largest repairs were already behind them. He realized the same thing had quietly happened inside the people standing around that house. Jade no longer believed that carrying every burden alone proved her strength. Roy no longer believed that vulnerability made him any less dependable. Greg no longer measured the value of doing the right thing by whether everyone understood it. Each of them had changed without losing the qualities that defined them. The farmhouse was almost ready to welcome a new chapter. But long before the last wall was painted and the final tool packed away, something even more valuable had already been restored. Not the wiring, not the walls, not the rooms they had worked so hard to repair. The confidence that they could face life's hardest seasons together had found its way home before the renovation was ever finished 2 weeks later. The farmhouse welcomed its final inspection. Roy stood beside Jade near the front porch, while the county inspector made one last walk through the house. Every outlet had been tested. Every switch had been checked. The upgraded electrical panel had already passed its earlier review, leaving only the final confirmation that every completed repair met current safety requirements. The inspector moved from room to room without rushing. Roy found himself smiling every time another light turned on. A few weeks earlier, exposed wiring had stretched across open walls. Now warm light filled every room. Fresh paint covered the drywall. The trim had been installed. The furniture had been returned to its proper places. Even the family photographs were back on the shelves. The farmhouse looked like home again, only safer, only stronger. The inspector closed his clipboard. "Everything looks good." Jade released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Roy laughed quietly. "I think that's the first full breath you've taken in months." She smiled. "It might be." The inspector handed over the signed paperwork. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Jade replied. "You've put a lot of work into this place." Roy accepted the documents. "We've had a lot of good people helping us." The inspector nodded. "It shows." After his truck disappeared down the gravel driveway, the property became unusually quiet. No contractors, no deliveries, no ladders leaning against the walls, no extension cords running across the floor. The work was finally finished. Roy looked toward the barn, where stacks of leftover materials had been neatly organized. Only a few unopened boxes remained. Jade stepped onto the porch beside him. "I almost don't know what to do with myself." Roy laughed. "You could sit down." "I've forgotten how." "You'll remember." She leaned gently against him. "I hope so." Later that afternoon, they carried the last empty storage bin upstairs. Roy opened the bedroom window, while Jade folded the blanket they always kept at the foot of the bed. Everything had found its place again. The room looked almost exactly as it had before his deployment. Yet nothing felt exactly the same. Roy looked around slowly. When he left for deployment, he believed home was simply the place he wanted to return to. Now he understood something different. Home wasn't defined by walls, or furniture, or the address written on an envelope. Home depended on the people willing to face difficult seasons together. He smiled quietly. Jade noticed. What? I was remembering something. What? The whole drive back here. She folded another blanket. You were probably excited. I was. He laughed softly. I kept thinking about surprising you. She smiled. I'd say you succeeded. Maybe a little too well. She covered her face for a second before laughing. I don't think either of us will ever forget that day. I don't think so either. Roy walked toward the hallway. He paused beside the section where the worst electrical damage had been discovered. Nothing remained to suggest what had once been hidden there. Fresh paint covered everything. Only he and Jade knew what those walls had looked like before the repairs began. Jade joined him. You keep looking at that spot. I know. What are you thinking? Roy rested one hand lightly against the wall. I've been thinking about how easy it is to believe problems only exist when we can see them. She nodded thoughtfully. But some of the biggest ones stay hidden. He looked at her. Until something forces us to deal with them. She understood immediately. The wiring, the silence, the fear they had both carried. None of it had been obvious from the outside. Yet all of it had been changing their lives long before Roy returned home. That evening they cooked dinner together for the first time since his unexpected arrival. The kitchen felt different now, not because of the renovation, because they were finally moving through it the way they always had before deployment. Roy chopped vegetables. Jade prepared the sauce. They reached for the same utensil at the same time. She laughed. You've stolen my spoon. I thought it was community property. It definitely isn't. He surrendered it with exaggerated disappointment. I was hoping you'd forgotten. I remember every spoon in this kitchen. I should have known. The conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another. They talked about planting next spring's garden, about finally repairing the old porch swing, about inviting a few neighbors over once everything settled down. Ordinary conversations. Roy had missed them more than he realized. After dinner, they washed the dishes together. No one asked who should do more. No one quietly carried the entire task. One washed. One dried. The work disappeared twice as quickly. Jade smiled while putting away the last plate. I think we've become a better team. Roy looked at her. I think we stopped trying to be individual heroes. She laughed. That's probably healthier. I'd say so. As the evening faded into night, they carried 2 cups of coffee onto the porch. The same porch where they had once dreamed about restoring the farmhouse. The same porch where Roy had often imagined sitting again while he was deployed. The only difference was that he now appreciated those simple moments in a way he never had before. The fields stretched quietly beneath the fading sky. A cool breeze moved through the trees. The porch swing creaked gently as they sat side by side. Roy looked across the property. The barn. The repaired farmhouse. The driveway where he had first seen Greg's van. He remembered every emotion that had rushed through him that afternoon. Fear, confusion, suspicion, relief, understanding, gratitude. Every one of those feelings had led him here. Jade rested her head lightly against his shoulder. It finally feels finished. Roy smiled. The renovation does. She looked up. What doesn't? He wrapped an arm gently around her. I think coming home means something different to me now. She waited. I used to think coming home meant walking through the front door. He glanced toward the warmly lit windows behind them. Now I think it means walking into a place where people tell each other the truth, carry life's weight together, and never have to pretend they're stronger than they really are. Jade slipped her hand into his. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. They didn't need to. Everything important had already been said. As Roy looked once more toward the farmhouse they had worked so hard to save, one truth settled quietly in his heart. The greatest repair completed over the past several weeks had never been hidden inside the old walls of the house. It had taken place between two people who finally learned that honesty could build a stronger home than silence ever could. The days following the final inspections settled into a pace that felt familiar again. For the first time since Roy's unexpected return, mornings were no longer measured by contractor arrivals, inspection schedules, or deliveries of building materials. Instead, life slowly returned to the ordinary routines Roy and Jade had once taken for granted. Jade left for her hospital shifts carrying only her lunch bag instead of folders filled with estimates and invoices. Roy spent his mornings finishing small projects around the property that had been postponed while the renovation took priority. Some afternoons they worked together in the garden. Other evenings they simply sat on the porch and watched the sun settle behind the fields without feeling guilty that they weren't doing something else. The house no longer demanded every ounce of their attention. It finally allowed them to live inside it again. One Saturday morning, Roy loaded several leftover pieces of lumber into his truck. "I'll donate what we don't need," he said. Jade smiled. "You've become pretty organized. I learned from watching someone label every storage box in the house." She laughed. "I wondered if you noticed." "I noticed everything." She walked over and straightened the collar of his work shirt. "I like having you home. I like being here." Before leaving, Roy leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I won't be long." His first stop was the local hardware store to return a few unopened supplies. As soon as he stepped inside, the owner looked up from the front counter. "Morning, Roy." "Morning. House finally finished?" Roy smiled. "It is. I drove past a couple of days ago." The owner nodded with genuine approval. "Looks great." "Thank you." After processing the return, the owner rested both hands on the counter. "I'll admit something." Roy waited. "There was a lot of talking around town these past few months." Roy answered calmly. "I've heard." The owner sighed. "I've also heard the real story." Roy remained quiet. The older man continued. "My wife works with someone at the hospital." He smiled. "She told me how hard Jade had been working." Roy felt a quiet sense of relief. "She worked harder than anyone realizes." "So I've been told." The owner paused before speaking again. "I should have waited before forming an opinion." Roy appreciated the honesty. "I think a lot of people are realizing that." The man nodded. "Small towns have a way of filling in missing details." Roy smiled gently. "They do. But sometimes we forget to ask whether the details are true." The owner reached across the counter and extended his hand. "I'm glad everything worked out." Roy shook it. "So am I." When Roy stepped back outside, he noticed two men standing near a pickup truck in the parking lot. One of them gave him a friendly wave. "Good to have you back." "Thanks." "House looks terrific." "It finally does." There was nothing unusual about the conversation. No awkward pauses. No curious questions. No sideways looks. The subject quickly shifted to fishing conditions at a nearby lake before everyone continued with their day. Roy climbed into his truck with a quiet smile. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had happened one ordinary conversation at a time. That afternoon, Greg stopped by the farmhouse carrying a small cardboard box. "I found these in my garage." He placed the box on the porch. Roy opened it. Inside were several old tools he had loaned Greg years earlier while they repaired the barn roof. Roy laughed. "I completely forgot these existed." "So did I." Greg smiled. "I was cleaning the shelves this morning." Roy picked up one of the well-worn wrenches. "I was starting to think you'd decided to keep them." "I considered it." Greg grinned. "But I figured you'd eventually notice." Jade stepped outside carrying 3 glasses of iced tea. "I see somebody's returning borrowed property." Greg accepted a glass. "I figured it was about time." The 3 of them sat on the porch together. The conversation wandered easily from one topic to another. Local harvest schedules. The upcoming church picnic. Whether the old maple tree near the barn needed trimming before winter. Nothing about the afternoon felt strained. At one point, a neighbor slowed near the driveway while walking his dog. He waved toward the porch. "Afternoon." "Afternoon," Roy answered. The neighbor smiled at Greg. "Heard you've been keeping busy over here." Greg nodded. "We finally wrapped it up. I took a look when I drove past yesterday." The neighbor pointed toward the farmhouse. "You all did a fine job." "Thank you." The conversation lasted less than a minute before the man continued down the road. Greg watched him disappear. "That would have gone differently a few weeks ago." Roy nodded. "It would have." Jade leaned back in her chair. "I don't think people suddenly became different." Roy looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I think they finally had enough truth to replace the guesses." Greg smiled thoughtfully. "That's probably the best explanation I've heard." Roy looked across the yard toward the freshly painted farmhouse. He realized something important. No public meeting had been called. No one had stood in the middle of town explaining every permit, invoice, inspection, and hospital shift. Life itself had quietly revealed the truth. Neighbors saw the completed renovation. They saw Greg continuing to stop by openly. They saw Roy welcoming him instead of avoiding him. They saw Jade returning to church with the same quiet kindness she had always shown. Little by little, facts accomplished what arguments rarely could. That Sunday morning, Roy and Jade walked into church together. Several familiar faces greeted them. Conversations felt easy again. People asked about the renovation. They complimented the finished farmhouse. One older couple thanked Jade for continuing to care for patients while managing everything happening at home. Another family welcomed Roy back and asked about settling into civilian life again. No one mentioned the rumors. No one needed to. The season that had created them had already passed. As they walked back toward the truck after the service, Jade slipped her hand into Roy's. "I wasn't sure this day would ever feel normal again." Roy smiled. "I think normal looks a little different now." She looked at him. "In a good way?" "In the best way." During the drive home, the fields rolled by outside the windows. Just as they had on the afternoon, Roy returned unexpectedly. Only now, his heart was at peace. He thought back to the moment he had stopped in the driveway after seeing Greg's van. He remembered how quickly fear had begun writing a story before a single conversation had taken place. If he had refused to listen, if Jade had refused to speak, if Greg had walked away, their lives might have taken a very different path. Roy glanced toward Jade before returning his attention to the road. He understood now that assumptions had come far closer to costing him everything than the truth ever had. A few evenings later, Roy found himself standing alone near the end of the gravel driveway. The same driveway where his unexpected homecoming had begun. The fields stretched peacefully beneath the fading light. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut hay across the property, just as it had the afternoon he returned from deployment. He looked toward the house. The porch light glowed warmly against the fresh paint. The repaired windows reflected the evening sky. From outside, no one would ever guess what had once been hidden behind those walls. He smiled to himself. That thought felt familiar, because it wasn't only the farmhouse that had hidden something important. He heard the screen door open behind him. Jade stepped onto the porch, noticed where he was standing, and walked slowly down the driveway until she reached him. "You've been out here a while." "I know." She followed his gaze toward the road. "Thinking? A little?" She slipped her hand into his. "About what?" Roy let out a quiet breath. "The day I came home." She nodded gently. "I've thought about it too." He looked toward the place where Greg's van had been parked. "I can still remember every detail. The truck stopping, the van beside the barn, the front door opening." He smiled faintly. "I honestly believed I already knew the story." Jade squeezed his hand. "I know. I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for proof that the conclusion I'd already reached was right." He shook his head. "That's the part that stays with me." Jade looked at him carefully. You stopped believing your own memories. Roy frowned slightly. What do you mean? You trusted me for years. She smiled softly. You'd trusted Greg for years. You knew the kind of people we were. She paused. But one unexpected moment almost outweighed everything you'd already known. Roy didn't become defensive. Instead, he nodded. You're right. I let one picture become the whole story. They stood quietly for a few moments. The sound of crickets gradually replaced the daytime birds. Lights appeared in distant farmhouses across the countryside. Roy finally spoke again. I've replayed that afternoon more times than I can count. What changes each time? He smiled. The ending. She looked at him curiously. The first time I remembered it, I only thought about the fear. The second time, I remembered how relieved I was after walking into the house. The third time, he laughed softly. I remembered Greg standing there, holding nothing more dangerous than paperwork. Jade laughed with him. I suppose folders aren't very threatening. They can be when someone lets fear write the story. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. I'm thankful you stayed. Roy looked at her. What do you mean? You could have driven away. You could have demanded answers before listening. You could have let pride make every decision after that. She smiled warmly. But you stayed. Roy thought about those words. I almost didn't. She looked up. I know, but you did. He nodded. And you finally trusted me enough to stop carrying everything alone. I did, she answered with quiet certainty. I won't forget that lesson. Neither will I. They began walking slowly back toward the porch. Halfway there, Roy stopped again. You know something? What? I used to think that deployment taught me everything I needed to know about courage. Jade listened. I learned discipline, responsibility, commitment. He smiled thoughtfully. But I came home and discovered another kind of courage. She waited. The courage to admit you're overwhelmed. The courage to ask someone to help. The courage to believe the people who love you won't think less of you because you need them. Jade's eyes glistened. I think that's the lesson I needed too. They climbed the porch steps together. The old porch swing had finally been repaired. Roy sat first. Jade settled beside him. For a while, they simply watched the lights inside the farmhouse shine through the windows. The same lights that had nearly gone dark forever because of wiring no one could see. Roy quietly broke the silence. If Greg hadn't walked out of that house when he did, Jade smiled. You would have walked in expecting a completely different story. I would have. He looked toward the front door. I thought that moment was going to become the worst memory of my life. Instead, it became the moment that forced all of us to tell the truth. Jade nodded. It changed everything. It did, but not for the reasons I believed that afternoon. Roy leaned back against the porch swing. He thought about Greg honoring a promise, even when it made life more difficult. He thought about Jade working exhausting hospital shifts, meeting inspectors, studying invoices, and trying to protect both their home and her husband. He thought about himself sitting in his truck, allowing fear to speak louder than years of trust. Every one of them had entered that season, believing strength meant carrying more by themselves. Every one of them had left it understanding something entirely different. Roy looked toward the fields one last time before turning back to the home they had fought to preserve. If there was one lesson he hoped people would remember from their story, it wasn't about electrical repairs or old farmhouses. It was about the quiet choices people make every day. The choice to ask instead of assume. The choice to listen instead of accuse. The choice to speak honestly instead of hiding behind silence. He had learned that love did not become stronger because two people protected each other from every burden. It became stronger when they trusted each other enough to carry those burdens together. Trust wasn't built by always having the right answers. It was built by choosing truthful conversations over comfortable silence, shared responsibility over lonely struggle, and patience over quick judgment. Roy looked at Jade, smiled, and gently took her hand. At last, he understood that the day Greg walked out of his house had never been the beginning of the end. It had been the beginning of a marriage, learning how to come home to each other all over again. And sometimes the strongest words love can ever speak are simply the truth.